Good morning. It's really good to see you this morning. I want to welcome back those who were with us last night, and then welcome those who are just coming to us today for the first time, and then welcome those who are watching online. It's really good to see everyone this morning. We have a lot of wonderful things in store for us today. Because there are some folks who were just able to join us today, I wanted to take a few minutes to review and kind of reintroduce the Gospel Initiative. This event is put on by the Gospel Initiative, which is a work of Denver Seminary in helping to come alongside the church and help the church engage difficult, complex challenges in the world around us in ways that are compelling, compassionate, and credible. So our heart is to address and to be willing to have the hard conversations about things around us in our world, in our society, that are very complex and difficult, that can sometimes be divisive, and to help walk through those things in ways that are a positive public witness. So to that end, TGI, or the Gospel Initiative, hosts events like this, as well as training and resources for churches and individual Christians working in the nonprofit sector and in other areas, resources on our webpage, and certainly we will be adding more events this year to try and help the church engage well. So that is what the Gospel Initiative is about. These events, I think, really address the credibility issue, or at least that's what we're trying to do with these events. One of the pieces of being credible, I think, in our world today is being willing to study and learn issues, to look at it from different perspectives, to hear from people who have different perspectives, to hear from those who are most affected by the complex challenges that we face. And so in our attempt to have a more credible public witness, these events draw experts from the field and the area that we're talking about, and we want to listen and learn, and that will certainly be happening today. We have an incredible panel of experts with us today. Last night, we had a wonderful time of sharing initially some of our theological beliefs that come out of the first few chapters of Genesis that ground us in the entire biblical narrative, and places and theological beliefs that we all share. And then we got a wonderful opportunity to hear from our guests, our panelists, and all of our speakers today about their own journeys of faith, their relationships with Jesus, and their interaction with those theological beliefs, which I think set us up well for today. We share all of these beliefs in common: our relationship with Christ, our love for Jesus, and now we will get to hear different perspectives about how we come at Genesis 1 and 2 and that question of human origins, which is an incredibly important question. It raises all kinds of issues that I think are relevant to the conversation around us in the world today, whether that's from artificial intelligence to the dignity and worth of individuals. All of those things, I think, come out of a good discussion around human origins, and that's where we're headed today. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning, so you can hear from him rather than me. And I am going to read, because these are impressive bios, and I want to get everything exactly right. So biochemist Dr. Fazale, or Fuzz, he assures me it's okay to call him by Fuzz. But Dr. Rana is president, CEO, and senior scholar of Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to communicating the powerful scientific case for God's existence and the Bible's reliability to both Christians and non-Christians. And we're co-sponsoring this event with Reasons to Believe. Rana converted to Christianity during graduate school. Though he initially embraced the evolutionary paradigm, he eventually drew the conclusion that only a creator's involvement could explain the elegance of biochemical systems. After a pastor challenged him to read the Bible, Dr. Rana became convinced of the validity of Christ's claims and of his own need for a savior. He earned a BS in chemistry with highest honors from West Virginia State College and a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. He also completed postdoctoral work at the universities of Virginia and Georgia. Before joining Reasons to Believe in 1999, he worked for 7 years as a senior scientist in research and development for Procter & Gamble. To date, Dr. Rana has addressed more than 500 university, church, and conference audiences in the United States and abroad. His books include Humans 2.0, The Cell's Design, and Fit for a Purpose. So will you help me to welcome Dr. Rana? Thank you so much for being here.
Well, can everybody hear me okay with this? All right, perfect. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well this morning. You all look well. Hope everybody's in good health and in good spirits. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much to Denver Seminary and to the Gospel Initiative for inviting us here on campus to take part in the programming of the Gospel Initiative and to do a topic like the question of human origins. I thank you, Dr. Taylor, and also want to thank Jason Woodman, and I'm sure there's all kinds of other people that have been working hard to make this event successful, that are behind the scenes, that gladly do that kind of work, and I don't even know who they are, but I know that they deserve our appreciation. This is going to be a morning and an afternoon where things may seem at times technical, things may seem at times a bit academic, but this is important because the implications of the questions of how we understand who we are as human beings are broad-ranging and impact how we as a church engage our culture and engage one another. What I'm going to be doing this morning is really giving you a bit of an overview of the approach that we take at Reasons to Believe, which is an old earth creationist approach. Now, our approach isn't the only old earth creationist model that's out there, but it is a model. It is a model, it's the model that we hold to. So I'm just going to give you a sense for what the model is about, and then very briefly show you how we engage with some of the scientific evidence relating to the origin of humanity. And the heart of our model is what I might call the traditional biblical view. And I know that's dangerous to use that terminology, but what I mean by that, it's the view that human beings were created by God through God's direct personal intervention, and that we were made in his image. And this is a quality that as human beings we uniquely possess. That Adam and Eve were the first human beings created by God, that they were real historical persons that gave rise to all human beings. So that's the perspective that we hold. And the question is, if this is the perspective that someone holds, that you hold or I hold, is it possible to hold this view in a scientifically credible way? So that's what we're going to be advocating with our particular model. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the image of God. And this is, again, a central point to our model. And as we heard last night, this is a critical idea that comes out of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's really a foundational idea theologically. But Scripture doesn't really do the best job of actually giving us a definition or a description as to what is the image of God precisely. And over the years, there have been theologians that have advanced a number of ideas. Three of the more prominent ones, but these are not the only ones, might be called the resemblance view, the representative view, and the relational view. And I'm using Jack Collins' terminology here to describe these perspectives. The resemblance view is the view that I hold and that we hold at Reasons to Believe. And it's the idea that human beings have a unique set of qualities that distinguish us from all other creatures. And that these qualities are qualities that we would share, but imperfectly and incompletely, but qualities that we would share with the Creator. Right? That's the resemblance view. The representative view is a view that's becoming probably much more popular among evangelical scholars, at least in my own assessment. And this is the idea that the image of God isn't so much qualities that we possess, but responsibilities that we uniquely have as human beings. So that we were to subdue the earth, to bring the earth under our control, to exercise dominion over the creation, right? We are to be stewards of the planet. We are to use the resources of the planet to promote human flourishing. These are our responsibilities. We are to be God's representatives here on earth. We are to be God's vice regents, carrying out responsibilities. And then the last view is that the image of God refers to our relationship status. That is, that we, as human beings, uniquely are involved in a relationship with our Creator, and that's what the image of God means. Now, I think it's important to note that even though I hold the resemblance view, these three perspectives are not mutually exclusive. Right? And in fact, I would agree with the representative view and the resemblance view. I just am of the opinion that the resemblance view subsumes all of these perspectives, because in order to function uniquely as God's representatives here on earth, or to uniquely be in a relationship with God, means that you must have some kind of qualities that distinguish you from other creatures. Therefore, you're essentially moving towards the resemblance view. Now, the reason I'm spending some time on this, number one, it's a fascinating discussion to me, but number two, more importantly, is that this actually impacts how we engage the scientific evidence with respect to our model from a resemblance view standpoint, as you'll see in a minute. I also take the perspective that Adam and Eve were anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens. And this is actually important today because there are evangelical scholars who are contemplating different identities for who Adam and Eve were. And so I take the view that, again, Adam and Eve are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. And there's a number of reasons for this. The simplest one is that, look, if we are all in Adam and we all are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, it's reasonable to think that Adam too was an anatomically and behaviorally modern human. Now, our model is a creationist model. So we eschew an evolutionary view of human origins. We would argue that, again, God is intervening in a direct way to create human beings, not through an evolutionary process, but again through his direct involvement, which then I think begs the question, well, what do you do with the evidence for human evolution? And we recognize that there is, compelling evidence that someone could interpret as evidence for an evolutionary origin of humanity. The hominin fossil record, which presumably is documenting this evolutionary ascent of humanity, and the shared biological features that we as human beings have with the great apes and other creatures. Right? This is considered the two broad categories of evidence for human evolution. Well, our approach is to recognize that indeed the hominins existed, that these were creatures that presumably emerged about 6 to 7 million years ago, that there are different categories of hominins, the Ardipithecus ramidus in the pre-Australopithecines, the Australopithecines, the habilines, erectines, and then archaic humans before modern humans appear on the scene, and that we can learn quite a bit about them from the fossil record, from the archaeological record about their biology, their behavior, their natural history. But we would take the view that these were creatures that were created by God, that had intelligence, emotional capability, but that they lacked something very special, which is the image of God. So we see them as real creatures that, again, had some kind of technology, culture, but they lacked the image of God. Now, lest you think that this is some kind of ad hoc perspective to deal with an uncomfortable truth, this is actually an idea that has a precedence in the history of biology. For example, the famous Harvard scientist Louis Agassiz, who was a devout Christian, held the view that the history of life reflects a progressive series of creation events with biological groups originating from the mind of God. So this is in effect the position that we are adopting and modernizing with our particular view. Now, what about the homologies, right? The shared biological features. Again, we look to the history of biology to guide our response. And there were biologists prior to Darwin who were well aware of shared biological features. One of them was Sir Richard Owen, who played a critical role in elaborating the concept of homologies, which is the term used to refer to biological shared designs. And he argued that these shared designs have represent an archetype that existed in the mind of God that was then functionally manifested in the created order. All right, and so we would again take a similar view that these shared designs reflect these shared features reflect common design, not common descent. And I am a concordist too in terms of my approach to Scripture, which I know is a controversial view. But it's interesting that when I look at, for example, the creation account in Genesis 2, it seems to echo this idea of Owen's, where you have in Genesis 2:7, Adam being made from the dust of the earth and God animating him with the divine breath. And then Genesis 2:19 refers to God creating the animals, and yet they do not receive the divine breath, though they are too made from the dust of the earth. So there's an omission about them receiving the divine breath. And so from my perspective, what this is saying is that as human beings, we're going to be made out of the same stuff as other creatures. And so we would expect biological similarities. That isn't something that is contrary to the biblical text. And that the key difference really here isn't our biology, but it's really an immaterial aspect of our nature, which is the image of God. Okay, so then how do I make sense of the scientific record with regard to the origin of humanity? And there are three broad categories of evidence that I'm going to look at very briefly this morning, but probably spending most of my time on the archaeological record, because I'm of the view that the archaeological record tells us something very important about who we are as human beings and can be used to build a case that we actually are unique or exceptional as human beings in a way that aligns with the image of God concept. Now, from a resemblance view, I would take the position that the image of God consists of a number of components, right? That we have an intellectual capacity, technical inventiveness. We have the capacity for rational thought. We utilize symbols and manipulate those symbols, which leads to language and music and art, and that this is very much something that defines us as human beings. That we are moral creatures. We understand that there is right and wrong. We have a sense and a desire for justice. We're spiritual beings where we recognize a reality beyond this physical material universe and we desire to connect with it. We also are relational beings where we look to relate to one another and we form very complex social hierarchical systems as human beings. And I think that aspect is reflected in what we would call our theory of mind, where we recognize that others have minds like ours and we want to engage and connect our minds together. Now, I take the perspective that the archaeological record is a valuable tool in determining, again, whether or not humans are exceptional, who has what capacities. And the idea here is that the behavioral capacities, the cognitive capacities that a creature has is going to be reflected in the archaeological record. And so the archaeological record becomes a signature or a marker for the image of God. Now, this is a cartoon that gives you a very broad overture of what the archaeological record looks like. And this is taken from the first edition of my book, Who Was Adam?, which was published in 2005. So there might be a few points of discrepancy here, but it's going to communicate the general point. The very first stone tool use seems to date to about 2.5 million years ago and is associated with Homo habilis. Now, there's some evidence that the Australopithecines were engaged in tool use, but these were not stone tools that they were making. And this Oldowan technology consisted of really primarily the creature habilis taking a hammer stone and striking another stone called a core stone, producing flakes that were then used as tools. These are sometimes called expedient tools because after the tool was used, it usually was discarded by Homo habilis. This is called the Oldowan technology or the Mode 1 technology. It persists till maybe about 1.8 million years ago, thereabouts, and we see a new technology on the scene. This is the Acheulean technology used by Homo erectus, which again is not only primarily involved in flake production, but also the Homo erectus was shaping the core stone into a variety of forms that had more or less specialized use. This is a picture of the types of tools that Homo erectus was manufacturing. And then this technology persists for well over 1 million years. And then, again, broadly speaking, the next significant step change in technology is associated with Neanderthals and our other archaic Homo sapiens or archaic humans. This is called the Mousterian technology, and it is much more sophisticated than what Homo erectus uses. And then lastly, we see a technology called Mode 4 technology that is characteristic of modern humans, that is, I would argue, even much more sophisticated than what we see Neanderthals engaged in. Now, when you look at this diagram, it's very easy to say, well, it does indeed look like there is this upward trajectory in sophistication and technology, right? And of course, we're comparing the technology, these hominins, with modern humans and what we do as the endpoint. But what if we bring into the equation another endpoint, another marker? And will that help us to maybe see what might be distinguishing features in the technologies? And I think it's valuable to think about what chimpanzees are doing in terms of technology. There's been, in the last 15 years, some remarkable observations of chimpanzee behavior in captivity and, more importantly, in the wild. And these creatures are doing some remarkable things. For example, chimps have been observed manufacturing spears to hunt with. It's actually a 6-step manufacturing process where they will make spears. They also make some pretty ingenious tools to extract termites from nests or to fish algae from bodies of water. They'll make stone tools that they will use to open up nuts, for example. Chimps will occupy caves seasonally to avoid inclement conditions. They fabricate beds through a very sophisticated process where they select certain branches from certain trees that have the just right tensile properties that they will use to fabricate beds. They'll incorporate plant materials into the beds that actually have insect repellent properties. So very sophisticated. They mourn their dead. They make medicinal use of plants. This is actually pretty sophisticated behavior, but to me, it's reminiscent of what you see with Homo habilis and with Homo erectus. And so, for example, Julio Mercader and collaborators in an article published in PNAS a few years ago now make this very point, that really the chimpanzee culture is comparable to that of hominins, of the early hominins. They said, for example, the full implications of this line of work require a reevaluation of the terms under which we can make meaningful comparisons of Oldowan and chimpanzee cultures. The behavioral variables documented at Nuolo, which is remarkably an archaeological site for chimpanzee tools that goes back to about 5,000 years ago, indicate that chimpanzees and hominins share cultural attributes, including the transport of stones across the landscape for a projected use elsewhere, the optimal combination of raw material size and weight criteria to perform a predictive activity, the reoccupation of focal points, creation of activity areas, the use of locally available resources, and the curation and selection of specific types of stones that are most optimal for specific technological activities. So the point here is that really, from our model, we would think that the habilines and the erectines are really clustering with chimpanzees in terms of their behavioral capacities, right? And that they are, again, remarkable creatures, but that what they're doing is not something that we would attribute to the image of God. Now, I'm going to put a pin in Neanderthals for discussing Neanderthal behavior for a minute and now focus on modern humans. When modern humans appear on the scene, there is a a significant step change in sophistication in terms of the archaeological record. And a number of years ago, there was a concept that anthropologists had advanced called the sociocultural Big Bang. And the idea is that about 40,000 years ago in Europe, something triggered an event where out of nowhere, this sophisticated behavior emerges for modern humans, and that it then culturally spread to different parts of the world. And people wondered what could be the trigger for this dramatic event that suddenly led to, again, a dramatic increase in sophistication of technology. And this is how Christopher Stringer, in the late 90s, described this event. He said, before then, Homo sapiens, and what he means here are not modern humans, but the archaic humans, were simply marking time culturally. For millennia upon millennia, they've been churning out the same forms as stone utensils, but then about 40,000 years ago, a perceptible shift in the handiwork took place. Toolkits leapt in sophistication. Signs of the use of ropes, bone spear points, and fish hooks emerge, and harpoons emerge, along with the sudden manifestation of sculptures, paintings, and musical instruments. We also find for the first long-distance exchange of stones and beads. It's an extraordinary catalog of achievements that just come from nowhere. Now, this idea has been supplanted now based on archaeological finds that we see in Southeast Asia. People have discovered cave art in Southeast Asia that is older than the cave art in Europe and is actually equivalent in terms of the sophistication of the cave art. And as a result of this indicates that humans must have had capacity for symbolic expression, because art is a proxy for symbolic capabilities, even before we began to migrate around the world, well before 60,000 years ago. Christopher Stringer more recently has said, it's a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there 60,000 years ago. It might have even been in Africa before 60,000 years ago, and it spread with modern humans. This was not cultural diffusion, but an innate capacity that humans carried with them as we migrated around the world. And interestingly enough, in the coastal caves of South Africa, there are artifacts between 50 and 80,000 years ago that indicate symbolic capabilities. In fact, there is evidence at 77,000 years ago for the oldest abstract drawing in the Blombus caves. So that means that this symbolic capability was present at 80,000 years ago in modern humans. Interestingly enough, recently there was a publication of the oldest ritualistic intentional burial dating at 78,000 years ago in the coastal area of Kenya. And this is significant because these deliberate ritualistic burials indicate that humans had a understanding of their own mortality, which is something that animals don't have. And that we also recognize that the funerary practices are a means by which we help that individual transition from this realm of existence to the afterlife, right? And so this is indicating very sophisticated understanding of the world and a very complex sense of what the world is like, both a physical and an immaterial aspect to the world. Now, there is also some evidence that suggests a flickering maybe of symbolism even earlier than 80,000 years ago. And interestingly enough, there's work published by Miyagawa, who's a paleolinguist at MIT, who argues that the rock art produced by the San, which dates to about 70,000 years ago, is comparable to the cave art that we see in Europe with respect to a number of features. And he argues that if this is the case, then it means that symbolic expression dates back to even earlier than 100,000 years ago. And so it looks as if this capacity for behavioral sophistication goes back to, again, about less or earlier than 100,000 years ago. Now, this is significant because this is about the window of time where anatomically modern humans show up in the fossil record, which is in the neighborhood of 130 to 150,000 years ago. Now, I know that there are hominin specimens that are identified as Homo sapiens that are at 250,000 years ago. These are near anatomically modern humans that actually have some key morphological differences compared to the modern humans that you see at 130,000 years ago. I'm not going to get into those details. I can if you're interested. So then what about Neanderthals, right? Because most people are aware of the claims that are in the scientific literature that Neanderthals made art, made jewelry, made music, possessed language, buried their dead ritualistically, mastered fire, the list goes on, right? Doesn't that mean that Neanderthals were just like us, right? That they were exceptional too, that they had symbolic capability, and if so, that creates a problem for our model. It doesn't create a problem for the Christian faith, because there are some evangelical scholars who would include Neanderthals as image bearers, but for our model, it's problematic. Now, I'll point out that every one of these claims is disputed in the scientific literature, that there is evidence for this behavior. There's also evidence that suggests Neanderthals didn't have these capabilities. So there is a debate taking place in anthropology as to what was indeed the capacity of Neanderthals. And just to give you an example of how this debate looks, this is a bone flute that is presumably manufactured from the femur of a cave bear. It's been hollowed out. It looks like two holes have been punched. These bone flutes show up in modern human archaeological sites quite often. They're found, to my knowledge, only one time at a Neanderthal site. I could be mistaken, but that's my understanding. And so on that basis, people argued, well, Neanderthals had musical capability. The problem is that when people analyzed the perforations using microscopic methods, it was very clear that those perforations weren't produced by a tool, but by the scavenging activity of spotted hyenas. So this is the challenge that you have trying to interpret the archaeological record and extracting meaning in terms of capabilities from it. It's not an easy thing to do. To me, what cinches the deal that Neanderthals were not like us has to do with the trajectory of our technologies. Neanderthals were on Earth longer than we've been on Earth as humans, and their technology remained relatively static. Humans had been on Earth maybe 130, 150,000 years ago, and our technology went from a primitive form to being able to put human beings on the moon. This is what Noam Chomsky, Ian Tattersall, and others in a review article write. Our species was born in a technologically archaic context, and significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinctive species, but was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. The stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. Right? So I think that when we look at the archaeological record, we can make a case that anatomically and behaviorally modern humans stand apart from other creatures in a way that resonates with the image of God concept. Now, the fossil record, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, other than to emphasize the fact that modern humans have a distinct morphology with respect to our cranial facial anatomy. We have globular skulls, a flat face, and a retracted chin. Now, in comparison, Neanderthals, which had a brain size maybe even larger than ours, actually had an elongated skull and a chin that jutted out. Now, this difference in skull anatomy has profound implications in terms of brain structure. It allows for an expansion of the parietal lobe and the cerebellum. It also, because of the size of the orbits of Neanderthals, we can infer that a greater area of their brain proportionally was devoted to processing visual information than in modern humans, right? And for that reason, it looks as if Neanderthals had a brain structure that would not make it possible for them to engage in symbolic expression. I'm going to skip these next two slides. Okay, last but not least, what about molecular anthropology? This is a relatively new area in the study of human origins, where in effect, scientists are looking at genetic variability of people around the world and trying to work out what the early history of humanity would look like. And the big question that comes from this has to do with, were there two human beings that gave rise to all humanity? And the consensus among scientists is there's no way that you can have the genetic variability that we see today coming from two individuals, that there had to be a population of several thousand in order to explain the genetic variability that we see today. And part of the reason for this is, one, evolution is understood as a population level phenomena. Individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. And therefore, if you're going to take an evolutionary perspective on human origins, there has to be a population. There can't be two individuals. To say otherwise would be an absurdity. But also, and I apologize for these equations, but these are two equations that are kind of foundational to population genetics. And these equations are in effect relating genetic variability, which is H, to effective population size, which is N, and then U, which is the mutation rate. And if you rearrange the equation, if you know genetic variability and mutation rate, you can estimate population sizes. And so people develop these pretty sophisticated models, mathematical models, that import genetic variability into them and then produce estimates for population sizes. But as my friend Josh has pointed out to me, these models are not giving us minimum population sizes, but time average population sizes. And this may seem like a very technical point, but if it's a time average population as opposed to a minimum population, what that means is that in that window of time, there very well could have been two people that then very quickly that started as the human population and very rapidly expanded to a large number of individuals. Now, again, it doesn't mean that there's evidence genetically for a historical Adam and Eve. It just means that the science of population genetics cannot rule that out. Now, I'm going to put up a picture of this paper written by Ola Hosser and Ann Gager with some trepidation, because I know this is a controversial paper. But what I'm pointing out with this paper is this, that to my knowledge, this is the first time and the only time, and I could be wrong about this, so if I need to be corrected, I'm happy to be corrected, where somebody actually said, what if we started with two people? Is it possible to start with two people and account for the genetic variability that we see today? And the reason why I think this is a significant departure in approach is that everybody else is going backwards, starting with today's population and working backward. So this is actually an area that potentially could be fruitful in terms of investigation. And again, I know this paper is controversial and that probably Jeff and Dennis and Josh would strongly disagree with the contents of this paper and the methodology, but again, I think it's important for that reason. So bottom line is, if you actually take the position that there was a real historical Adam and Eve that were sole progenitors of humanity made in God's image, I think you can hold that position with integrity, with scientific integrity, though again, it's not a view that's within the mainstream, but it's still a view that you could hold with integrity. One final thing, and then I'll surrender the platform here. Just as a way to say thank you for all of you for coming, if you scan this QR code, or you can go to our book table and scan the QR code, we actually have a gift for you, a free book that we'd love to give you called Testable Faith. So love to, just our way of saying thank you to you. All right, so I'm done. I'll let Josh come on up.